Okay, hopefully everybody had a good spring break. Looks like a lot of people decided not to come back. Hopefully everyone also got my email about skipping chapter 10, right? We're a little bit behind schedule, and I feel like we got to test something. Biotechnology is probably one of the good ones to lose. So today we're going to get started on chapter 11, which is about evolution. We should have plenty of time to finish this one and maybe get out a little bit early. Unfortunately, I won't be handing back the exams yet because I'm not quite finished grading them. But so far, they're looking a lot better than the last one. This average is almost, from what I've graded so far, the average is substantially higher. So good job on that. All right, so evolution. I would assume most of you guys would hopefully be able to recognize that guy from this picture. He's one of the most famous scientists in history. That is Charles Darwin. You can't talk about evolution without talking about Darwin, because he was the guy that first proposed the theory of natural selection. So remember, it wasn't all that long ago that we thought that all organisms were created in their present form, and that present form was unchangeable, and they always stayed like that. Darwin was one of the first people to really openly question that. He was one of the first to put forth a theory to explain how species would change over time. He's also really closely associated with the Galapagos Islands. That's because it was while he was visiting the Galapagos Islands that he made the observations that eventually led to his theory of natural selection. It's kind of funny, if you go to the Galapagos Islands, they all love him there. Like, streets are named after him, and shops are named after him. People name their kids Charles Darwin, whatever the last name is going to be. But they're also all super Catholics, and none of them believe in evolution. Good. Anyway. So this is a map of that voyage that Darwin took. You may notice that the picture of him in the upper left there looks very different from the one in the previous slide. Because when Charles Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands, he was 26 years old. He was a relatively young man. And he never actually went back. That was the only time he ever visited, was on this 5-year voyage around the world on a ship called the HMS Beagle. They visited all kinds of spots all over the planet. But his time in the Galapagos Islands was really formative and important for his theories in natural selection. It wasn't until more than 20 years later, after this one and only visit to the Galapagos, that Darwin ended up writing his book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. This was an incredibly important book. This was the first writing that really put forth any theories regarding natural selection or evolution. It wasn't all that well received at the time, particularly by members of the public outside the scientific community. But he'd amassed such good evidence for his case that it became really, relative to other theories, exceedingly quickly accepted within the scientific community. And just for fun, some of the cool animals in the Galapagos, the blue-footed booby. When I was working there, me and the guy I was working for made so many jokes about that. And everybody else on the research crew was native Ecuadorian, so they didn't understand why we were laughing. Marine iguana. That guy's actually underwater. How cool is that? These things swim around in the water and they eat algae off the rocks. Here's another important one. Anyone know what that is? Here's a finch. This is one of the several Galapagos finches that Charles Darwin observed, which were what really inspired sort of were the first inspiration for his theories on natural selection. What?
Why was it such a...
So we'll get into it more, but there's several different species of Galapagos finch that are all extremely similar. The main thing that varies between them is the size and shape of their beaks. So some of them have huge, broad, thick, strong beaks like that. Some of them have like really fine, pointy, thin beaks. And they're specially adapted for eating different kinds of foods. Anyway, so Darwin knew that what he was initially proposing was going to be really groundbreaking and really hard for a lot of people to accept because it challenged a lot of people's closely held beliefs. That's not something that most people respond well to. So to sort of break it in and introduce the concept a little bit more softly, he developed a large part of that book to just exploring the adaptations of organisms to their environment. He began by discussing a lot more familiar examples of modified species, in the case of domesticated plants and animals. So you guys are probably aware, you may not, you will be in a second, that most of the foods you eat are not natural. They're not natural species. Almost everything you've ever eaten, unless it's a wild-caught fish, has been heavily genetically modified by hundreds or thousands of years of artificial selection or selective breeding by people in order to enhance specific desirable characteristics. I mentioned that about corn a couple weeks ago, where I showed you what corn looked like before we started tinkering with it and what it looks like now. We've been doing that with all kinds of stuff. If you were to eat an orange in its ancestral form, it would probably taste incredibly sour and bitter and not sweet at all. And that's because for hundreds of years, we've been breeding the trees that produce the sweeter oranges with each other to produce even sweeter oranges. If you were to look at an ancestral cow, it looks nothing like modern cattle look today. We've been breeding those things selectively to produce cows that have higher amounts of meat and also higher amounts of fat in the meat because that's what makes it delicious. So for hundreds or even thousands of years with certain crops, we've been selectively breeding ones to enhance specific desired traits. More meat, more sugar, better flavor, stuff like that. This is what's known as artificial selection. So in this image here on the left, there are 5 fairly well-known agricultural crops. So you've got kale, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, broccoli, and kohlrabi. So maybe 4 well-known ones you probably haven't heard of before. These are all derived from the wild mustard plant. By selectively breeding the wild mustard plant in order to enhance certain characteristics, we've produced 5 pretty different vegetables. So if you have the ability to produce, and this all happened over the course of just a couple hundred years. So if you have the ability to produce these massive changes in such a short amount of time with artificial selection, it should make sense then that over the course of geological time, hundreds of thousands, millions, tens, hundreds of millions of years, then great changes could occur to species that way as well through natural selection. Does this make sense to everybody so far? Great. So, Darwin then explained that a similar process to this artificial selection could occur in nature. He called this process natural selection. So when we're talking about humans selectively breeding things in order to enhance specific desired characteristics, we term that artificial selection because we're creating it. When it happens in nature as a result of natural forces, we call it natural selection. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cold here, so I'm drinking hot tea so I can keep my voice. If I lose my voice halfway through, we'll just cancel lecture. All right. So, Darwin then described 2 different observations from which he was able to draw 2 different inferences. The first observation being that members of a population often vary in their inherited traits. That seems pretty obvious. You look around this room, I see all kinds of different skin tones, hair colors, eye colors, different heights, different straight and curly hair, stuff like that. So any population is going to have at least some degree of variability in the heritable traits that organisms get from their parents. The second observation was that all species are capable of producing more offspring than the environment can support. This is true of any organism. If I wanted to, if I could find enough girls, I could have thousands of kids. Every guy in here could. And every woman could have a baby every 9 months for most of her life until she gets menopause. And even as humans, our reproductive potential is a lot lower than a lot of other organisms. Like, dogs or cats will often have 3, 4, 5, 8 babies for one baby. So any organism has the potential to produce more offspring than the environment can support. What limits how much an environment can support?
Nutrients.
Yeah, nutrients, food, all kinds of other resources, space sometimes. So if you can't find anywhere to live. But bear in mind that every single organism on Earth is capable of reproducing more offspring than its environment is capable of supporting. So if you look at those 2 observations, that leads you, or at least it led Darwin, into a couple of inferences. Number 1 being that individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment will tend to have more offspring than other individuals. So we have that variability in inherited traits in any population. If the traits you have make you better able to survive and reproduce, then it stands to reason that you're going to reproduce more offspring than another individual whose traits are less beneficial. That leads into inference number 2, which is that the unequal production of offspring resulting from the differential traits things inherit will lead to the accumulation of favorable traits in a population over generations. So if your traits are beneficial, if they allow you to survive and reproduce more successfully, then the next generation is going to have more of your genes than it will of genes from someone whose traits are less beneficial. That makes sense, right? So when you break it down like this, no one really has any problem with any of these points. It makes the basics of evolution at least very easy to understand. So does anyone have any questions about any of these observations or inferences? This all makes pretty good sense? All right, cool. So Darwin then reasoned, as I mentioned earlier, that if artificial selection can bring about really dramatic changes in plants and animals over a short period of time, then it stands to reason that natural selection could also bring about pretty dramatic changes if given time on the geologic scale. Thousands, millions, hundreds of millions of years. Now at this point, it's important to emphasize a few key points about evolution by natural selection. I guess before you go into that, I should mention that evolution and natural selection aren't necessarily interchangeable terms. Evolution is an observable natural phenomenon. We see species change over time. Natural selection is the mechanism that causes evolution. All right, so first, although natural selection occurs through interactions between individual organisms and their environment, individual organisms themselves do not evolve. So I was born with the genes I have, and those are the genes I'm always going to have. There is no form of natural selection that can change my genes. Nothing's going to cause me to have brown eyes or black hair or something like that. Instead, it's the population that evolves over time, usually many, many generations, except in a few exceptions. When adaptive traits become more and more common in the group, and other traits either change or disappear. So evolution always happens at the population level, never at the individual level. Second, is that natural selection, well, before I go on, everybody's comfortable with this? Everybody's got that? Okay. Because there's probably going to be a question on quizzes and tests about whether or not individuals can evolve. Someone will get it wrong, don't let it be you. All right. So the second of these is that natural selection can amplify or diminish only heritable traits, only things that can be passed from one generation to the next. So an individual organism may become modified throughout its life by interaction with its environment or some other factors. But unless those modifications the organism accumulates are coded for in its genes, they won't be passed on to their offspring. So I can change myself pretty dramatically if I want to. I can dye my hair black, I can get a super dark tan, I can go to the gym and get super ripped if I want to. But none of those things are going to change the genes that I'm putting into my gametes, so they can't be passed on to my offspring. Like, it would be absurd to think that a bodybuilder who does steroids his whole life is going to have really jacked babies. Or if someone gets in a car wreck and loses a leg, that doesn't mean their kids are going to be born with only one leg. Because these are not things that are coded for in genes. These are modifications that are the result of external environmental factors. Yes?
How possible are you with that? Because I think there's a lot of evidence that supports, like say, if you spend like a lot of time in the sun, there's definitely an increased chance that your kids will get skin cancer. But they aren't coded for you in your genes from your parents, but you did that in your lifetime.
So there's an emerging field in genetics which has only come out in the last 20 years or so called epigenetics. And we're discovering that certain things you do over the course of your life can affect the way your genes are packed and expressed, but they're not actually changing the genes. So there's evidence to suggest that people who smoke, for instance, are going to pass on, I gotta word this really carefully. So it's going to change the way that their genes will be expressed in their sugar. It doesn't actually change the genes though. And it goes way beyond the scope of this class and beyond my area of expertise to really explain why this is. But for the most part, modification of an individual will not affect their offspring, for the most part. But you're right that there is some evidence to suggest that things we do during our life may have some effect. All right, does everybody get this part? So natural selection can only act on heritable traits. Third, okay.
So yeah, a question. So artificial selection and natural selection. Artificial selection, is that only human beings modifying the environment, or can there be other external factors that suddenly change the environment that we could consider artificial selection?
Well, generally it's only considered artificial selection when humans do it deliberately. So things that we do that may have some ancillary effect that may cause changes in another organism, we would generally still term that natural selection. And there is a good example of that. So in England, around the time of the Industrial Revolution, there was a species of moth. And that moth generally would live on the trunks of trees on the side, just hanging out in the bark. Before the Industrial Revolution, those tree trunks were all covered with a white lichen, which is a symbiosis of a moss and algae. Or fungus and algae, sorry. So the two color types that existed in that moth population were either like light colored, sort of like a gray with speckles, or dark colored, where they were almost black. The black moths were really super rare because they stuck out really easily against those white tree trunks. Then after the Industrial Revolution, we started burning coal wholesale. All the coal soot would settle on the trees and turn the trunks almost black. So in a matter of a few years after that, they saw a huge shift in the population where suddenly the black moths were better camouflaged and they were able to survive and reproduce better. So in just a few short generations, they went from being predominantly white to being predominantly black. That's driven largely by human activity, but we'd still call it natural selection. Because the direct pressure, direct selective force on that moth population was still natural, which was their predators, the birds that would eat them. The environment changed, but the selective pressure was still supplied by a natural force.
So basically, artificial just means that we actually intend to do it, not just some type of natural causation.
Yeah, artificial is when we are directly forcing specific individuals to breed or directly culling specific individuals from the crop or herd or something like that. Good question. Anything else before we move on? Okay. So, the third point to make is that evolution is not goal-directed, and it does not necessarily lead to perfectly adapted organisms. So I was browsing Reddit the other day, and I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar with that website, and someone posted a question in the Ask Science sub about whether or not there are any organisms other than plants that can photosynthesize. Now, I'm sure you guys by now hopefully all know that there are. Algae can photosynthesize, some bacteria can even photosynthesize. But then that led to this discussion about why can't animals do it? Because it really would be convenient if I didn't need to eat, if I could just go lay out in the sun and breathe in some carbon dioxide and make my own organic energy. So someone was saying, well, why didn't that evolve? Why can't we do that? And it's because things don't evolve, like traits don't arise because they're good. They don't arise because they're beneficial. They arise through random chance and mutation. And then they are selected for or selected against because they're good or bad. Also important to remember is that natural selection is the result of environmental factors that can vary between places and over time. So in a certain situation, something that's selected for because it's beneficial in that situation may later on be selected against if the factors change a little bit. Great example being those moths. Those white wings were great. they were a great adaptation to have for a long time until the environment changed and suddenly they were detrimental and they were selected against.
Are there species with like short lives to where they, where their genetic expression changes over the year because of seasons?
If their generation time were short enough, potentially. So if something had a generation time of like a month, then you could definitely see shifts in allele frequencies throughout just the course of 1 year. But you would have to have at least a couple generations in order for that effect to be recognized. Anything else before we move on? Okay, so now we're going to talk more about those finches. So when Darwin was in the Galapagos Islands, he noticed several varieties of really closely related finches. Those are sketches of just a couple of them. And the main variation in these finches was in the size and or shape of their beaks. He was also observant enough to notice that they were really closely related to a species of finch that was on the mainland of South America. So everybody knows where the Galapagos Islands are, right? They're about 500 miles offshore of Ecuador in South America. So he noticed that they were very similar to a species that he'd seen on the mainland. So then he imagined that all those species of finch that he found in the Galapagos Islands may have all been modified species that had originated from that single original mainland species. He was really good at thinking outside the box. So a direct quote from him from On the Origin of Species: "Seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from the original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends." And people's speech sounded way fancier back then. Paucity, if you guys aren't familiar with that word, just means something being present in like really small or insufficient amounts. It's basically a synonym for scarcity. So he was looking at these things and he was thinking that they all varied in this one trait, but otherwise they were pretty similar to this one species you saw on the mainland. So he thought that maybe over time this mainland species had been modified into several different groups to serve different purposes or to fill different niches. And as we now understand, that is exactly what happened. But why do the different varieties exist? And how do they exist? I hinted at it earlier. Anyone have a guess? Yes.
Do all about the origin. So larger beaks are for more like seeds and eating like smaller little bits like that, and then the sharper, more pointy beaks are for hitting through wood or trying to get at bugs and
So what you're getting at is just that the different sizes and shapes of beaks are specialized for different types of foods. And you're right that the larger beaks are usually used for, or at least they're more effective at eating large, hard seeds. Smaller beaks are more effective at tiny, soft seeds or eating insects or something like that. So if you take a species and you put it into a new environment that has this broad range of resources it can use, but each of those resources is going to require slightly different equipment, over enough generations you should see it start to radiate into different forms, each of which possessing the equipment for one specific resource.
So if you were to pool all these birds together as just one population, that's more advantageous towards utilizing resources in the environment, right?
Yes. So there's a phenomenon in biology that we call niche partitioning, which is where different, like closely related species living in the same area will just spontaneously start using slightly different resources or slightly different areas to prevent competition. Because competition is bad for everyone. Even if you win, it's still bad for you because you had to expend resources to win that fight. You would have been better off if you never fought to begin with. So a lot of the times, organisms will sort of partition up the environment rather than compete for the same resources. So in this case, each of the species had evolved to eat specific foods, so there would be slightly less competition for limited resources. Now, important again to remember here that this doesn't happen on purpose. These birds aren't thinking like, okay, I'm gonna grow a bigger beak so I can eat different food from that guy so I don't have to fight with him. It just randomly happens by chance. How do new traits arise? Anybody? How do genes change? Mutation, exactly. So those really rare, tiny little errors in DNA transcription can sometimes give rise to new genes, and that's what we call a mutation. The vast majority of the time, that mutation won't even code for a new protein. And even if it does, the vast majority of the time, it probably won't be beneficial. But in extremely rare cases, that tiny mutation may code for a new protein that gives rise to a new trait that makes an organism better able to survive in its environment. It's a very slow process for the most part.
What made the Galapagos Islands so diverse?
So a big part of it is the fact that there were never any people there. There are no indigenous peoples to the Galapagos Islands, so there were no people to kill all the cool animals that evolved there. It's amazing how destructive people have been, even in prehistoric Stone Age times. The animals that used to exist in North America, for instance, like supposedly there were like 6 to 8 foot tall beavers and like gigantic brown birds and stuff like that. And like I think it was like a 9 foot tall sloth in North America. But our ancestors killed and ate them all. So that's part of why the Galapagos has such interesting biological diversity, is because there were no people to wreck up the place. There's only been people there for about 100 years. All right, so that phenomenon we were just talking about with the finches and adjusting their beak sizes, or I guess more accurately, having their beak sizes adjusted to fit the environment, has been observed in real time. Here's a pair of researchers that have been monitoring the Galapagos finch populations every year since the mid-70s. And there was a drought in the Galapagos Islands that greatly changed the vegetation. It resulted in way fewer seeds being produced by plants, in particular fewer small seeds, because the smaller a seed is, the easier it is for that seed to dry out. So there was a greatly reduced amount of food available for these finches, and the type of food that was left was mostly of one type. It was the larger seeds. So that resulted in a lot less food in general, but especially less food for the finches with small beaks. This resulted in a huge population crash. Most of the population starved, but the ones that survived tended to be more likely to be those finches with the larger beaks, because they were able to exploit more of the few resources that remained. They could crack those larger seeds, whereas the small beak finches couldn't. The average bill size in these finch populations was measurably larger the following year. So this is a histogram of beak size for these birds in 1976. And you can see the average here, which is denoted by that dotted red line, is about 9.5 millimeters beak depth. When they say beak depth, they just basically mean how tall the beak is. The following year, after that drought, the average beak depth was over 10 millimeters. So it had shifted substantially larger. Now you'll also notice, if you look at the sample size, over here they sampled 751 individual birds. Over here they only sampled 90. So there was a huge population crash, and the ones remaining tended to have larger beaks because that allowed them to exploit the few resources that were left.
But even with the less resources, there were less big people.
Yeah, there were less. Yeah, because there were less big seeds too. There were less seeds in general, and most of the few seeds that were left were larger. Now we also have some really more exciting and dramatic cases of evolution. So, you know, the size of a bird's beak, that's vaguely interesting, but it's really not that fun. Now in this case, it's a bit more fun. So these are two examples of really dramatic evolutionary adaptations, the flower mantid and the leaf mantid. These are insects that are really cool examples of evolutionary adaptation to survive in their environments. So if you look up here, This is a mantis right here. That's an insect. Looks like a flower. Right here, that's also an insect. It just looks like a gigantic leaf. So over many, many generations, these guys started to evolve body morphologies that allowed them to blend in with the plants that they tend to live on, which obviously helps them to avoid predation. It's important again to remember, though, that this wasn't a case of one of these bugs living on a flower and thinking like, oh, I'd probably survive better if I look like this flower, so I'm gonna make myself look like a flower. These aren't chameleons. What happened was some random mutation happened a long time ago that made one of these guys look a tiny bit more like the flower he was living on. And then that one ended up having a lot more offspring, and all of its offspring had that mutation. And that mutation began to accumulate and intensify until they ended up looking just like the flowers they live on. So we've also been able to directly observe this in action. The finches in the Galapagos is one example. A more socially important example is the evolution of pesticide resistance in a lot of insect species. And this is actually the exact same mechanism that drives antibiotic resistance, or the evolution of antibiotic resistance in bacterial diseases. So if you're introducing a new pesticide to any insect population, it's probably going to be very effective. Probably going to kill almost every single insect that's out there. However, the subsequent applications will be less and less effective. So this has to do with why it didn't kill all the insects the first time. Generally, with any sort of disease or any sort of chemical insecticide or antibiotic, there are going to be some individuals in the population that have randomly accumulated some mutation that makes them resistant to it. So the ones that survive that first application are generally going to possess some sort of genetic resistance. That means that they have some allele somewhere in their genome that codes for some protein that yields some trait that allows them to be resistant to the pesticide. When you put the pesticide into that population, then, it's going to kill the vast majority of the population. Pretty much all of the ones that don't have that resistance. What that's going to do is that's going to cut down competition for the ones that do have that resistance. So suddenly, there are no more conspecifics for them to have to fight with over food or over mates or over nests to live in. So that's going to allow the ones that are resistant to survive and reproduce much more effectively and efficiently. And what that's going to do is that's going to pass on that resistance to the next generation. So if all of the surviving insects have some sort of genetically built-in resistance to that pesticide, it's likely that they're going to give that resistance to most or all of their offspring. Yes?
Could, like the allele that makes them resistant, in the first part of the population, would that allele be recessive, but then in the future generations, would it be considered dominant? No.
So dominance and recession in alleles has nothing to do with whether or not they're beneficial. It just happens to be how the genes work out. However, if it is a recessive allele, the trait will become more and more common as that allele becomes more and more common, and individuals with a homozygous recessive genotype become more and more common. So it doesn't have to be dominant to be the wild type trait. Remember the case with freckles in humans. Freckles is caused by a dominant allele, but most people don't have freckles because the recessive non-freckle allele is much more common. So anyway, the next generation of these insects, which have inherited that resistance, are also going to face less competition. They're going to be born into a world where there's plenty of food and plenty of places to hide and no one to fight with over any of it. So as a result, they're going to thrive and they're going to produce many offspring of their own. And their offspring are also likely to inherit this allele that confers resistance to the pesticide. After enough generations, pesticide resistance will be pretty much pervasive throughout the population. Basically, everybody's gonna have it, because you've knocked out all the individuals that didn't, and the ones that did are able to reproduce much more easily. At that point, the pesticide becomes essentially useless. We've seen this happen numerous times. We're seeing this happen with a lot of our antibiotics as well. We've overused them to the point where we've wiped out basically all of the individuals in the bacterial populations that are susceptible to those antibiotics, leaving only the ones that were resistant to reproduce, creating whole populations that are resistant. It's going to be interesting to see how things look over the next 20 or 30 years. Because back about 100 years ago, before we had antibiotics, it was really common for people to die from simple infections. And that's probably going to start happening again in our lifetime. Now at this point, there are a couple of important points to note. One of which being that natural selection is an editing mechanism, not a creative mechanism. What I mean by that is that the application of a pesticide did not create the allele that allows the insects to resist it. That was not a response by the resistant individuals to create this resistance. That was already in their genome. All it does is knock out the individuals that do not have that resistance in their genome, thereby allowing the ones that do to thrive and pass on that resistance. The second important point to note here, as I briefly mentioned earlier, is that natural selection is very much contingent on time and place. It favors whatever traits or whatever heritable traits are beneficial in that place and in that time under those conditions. So going back to our pesticide-resistant insects example, if we were to then ban that pesticide, which we have done numerous times with other pesticides, and hopefully we will soon do with those neonicotinoid pesticides that are killing all bees, because we're going to die if we kill all bees. I don't understand why more people aren't freaking out about that. If we lose the honeybees, we're all dead. Anyway, if you ban that pesticide, then suddenly the allele that confers resistance to it is no longer beneficial. So then it's going to become less and less common in the population, as individuals born without it are still able to survive and reproduce. So it was selected for when the environment contained this pesticide that allows you to survive. But if the environment no longer contains that pesticide, if it doesn't provide some other benefit, it's just going to slowly drift out of the population. Everybody understand that? Yes.
So I just want to check if my kind of like thought process
Please
is
do.
on the same point. So the first point, like the way I'm thinking of it is like the bubonic plague of the 1400s, just like wiped out just this massive population in Europe, but some people obviously survived. And so the subsequent small outbreaks that happened over time were significantly less detrimental and lethal to the continent.
Yes.
But then, as far as point number 2 is concerned, they happened because as people started growing back and reproducing and populating the numbers again, it was basically bound to happen again. Or
Yeah, and because when the plague comes through and wipes out a huge portion of the population, I think in the year 1666 or something, it wiped out a third of Europe. Imagine if 1 out of every 3 people you use died in the space of 1 year. That's what happened. The people that survived it had some genetic resistance to it. So they were obviously able to survive and reproduce better, but then if you go 50 or 100 or 200 years without another major plague outbreak, then that resistance becomes less common again because people that don't have it are still able to survive and reproduce. Now here's an interesting thing. The plague virus exploits a specific cell receptor site on the white blood cells, I think it was, that is also shared by HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, which eventually causes AIDS. So if your ancestors lived through the big plague years in Europe, I think there's about a 10% chance that you have conferred genetic resistance to HIV, which is kind of cool. So it's the same kind of thing we just saw in these antibiotic-resistant or pesticide-resistant insects, where except it's happening for us, where our population becomes more resistant to the disease. Kind of cool. Works both ways.
Just It kind of happened with influenza as well too, right?
Probably, I don't know specifically, but I would imagine so.
I remember there being like learning about a major outbreak and then all of a sudden it just stopped.
Yeah, it was like, I think 1917, 1918, the flu year that killed like 1% of the world population.
Spanish flu epidemic, I think it was.
Could have been, I'd have to do some more reading on that.
1%.
What?
1%.
I think it was 1% of the population, I think. Yeah, it's
Not
huge
that
number.
number.
So I mean, right now, there are about 7.6 billion people in the world. So if 1% of everybody died, that's, what, 760 million? No, yeah,
Yeah.
760 million people. I mean, back then, I think there were about 1 billion people in the world. So it's like 100 million people died in 1 year, which is pretty wild. I mean, 100 million extra people. Hundreds of millions of people die every year. You just know that is forever. All right, any other questions before we move on? Okay, so this is also very important, and I can basically guarantee you will see this on a quiz and or test. Write this down. So 3 things must be true in order for natural selection to act on a trait. The first is, the trait must be variable. There must be at least 2 different forms of this trait that have different phenotypes in the population. Because if there's no variation in the trait, you can't pick one allele or the other, right? So the trait has to have at least 2 different forms. The second is that that trait must be heritable. It must be something that can be passed from one generation to the next. And then finally, the one that includes big words, the trait must contribute to differential reproductive success, which is just a fancy way of saying it must make the individual that possesses it either better or worse at reproducing. If it makes you better at reproducing, it's going to be selected for. If it makes you worse at reproducing, it's going to be selected against. If all 3 of those things are not true about the trait, natural selection cannot act on it. If even one of those things is not true, you can't act on it. So then what gives rise to all of these variable traits? We briefly talked about one of them, which is mutation. Now, you guys should also all be able to tell me something else that leads to increased genetic variation. Yeah, sexual reproduction. So mutation is what allows new traits to arise or new alleles to arise. Sexual reproduction increases the overall variability of genomes in the population by sort of reshuffling all of the alleles individuals get with each generation. So mutation, this is what creates actual new alleles, creates new genes, creates new DNA. And all it is a change in the nucleotide sequence in DNA, generally from errors in when the chromosomes get copied. So a mutation would be like if this strand was supposed to be AAGC and it ended up being AAGT, that's a mutation. Happens very rarely, about once for every billion base pairs that get copied, but it does happen. So then mutation is the ultimate source of genetic variation that serves as the raw material for evolution, or the raw material for natural selection to act on. I also briefly mentioned earlier that those mutations likely won't have any effect. And if they do, it's likely going to be a detrimental effect. So most mutations are not going to give you a beneficial trait right off the bat. In which case, most of them will be selected against, and generally won't spread throughout the population. On very rare occasions, however, you can have a mutant allele that can actually produce a beneficial adaptation that makes the organism better able to survive in its environment or better able to reproduce. I guess here I should probably also make a distinction. I'm sure everybody's heard the phrase survival of the fittest, right? This is what determines evolution, basically. The thing is, most people outside of science have a different definition of fitness than what we would use when actually talking about evolution. So Darwinian fitness doesn't necessarily have to do with being big or strong or, able to fight or kill somebody else. Darwinian fitness just refers to how successful you are at passing on your genes. That's all it is. So, to give a really extreme hypothetical example, someone that dies at the age of 20 but has 7,000 kids before they die has a higher Darwinian fitness than someone who lives to be 120 but only has one kid. It's all about passing on the genes. I don't know if 7,000 would actually be possible by that age, but you never know. You guys have all heard of Genghis Khan, right?
Yeah.
He was the king of the Mongols when they spread throughout most of Europe and Asia. He had this not very cool habit of every time they conquered a village, he would just take all of the pretty young girls and do stuff. And it is now estimated that 10% of Asia is a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. And one out of every 200 men currently alive is a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. That's the Darwinian fitness right there. If you ignore the horrible ethical implications, it's biologically fascinating. All right, so does anyone have any questions before we move on here? And he also did some good stuff too. Apparently he was like the first king to exempt the sick and the poor from having to pay taxes. So the guy had some compassion. Anyway, sexual reproduction. We've already talked about this in detail. None of this should look weird or new to you guys. You guys know that sexual reproduction increases genetic diversity through a couple of mechanisms like crossing over, like independent assortment, or random fertilization. Fresh assortments of alleles on chromosomes arise in every new generation due to crossing over. Fresh combinations of chromosomes arise due to independent assortment and random fertilization. None of this sounds new, right? Good. Okay, so now evolution. Notice I haven't been using this word much yet, because we haven't really been talking about it much yet. We've been talking about natural selection instead. So what is evolution? Who wants to give me a definition of evolution?
Change over time.
Yeah, it's a change in what over time?
Genes.
Yeah, genes, basically. So, if you really want to use it, define it in the simplest but most biologically accurate terms, it's just a change in allele frequency in a population over time. So, we're going to have a hypothetical example with a hypothetical population of blue-footed boobies. Those guys right there. So let's say in this population, you have two variations of the gene that codes for webbing on their toes. One gives you webbed toes, the other gives you non-webbed toes. And we're going to say that the non-webbed allele is dominant, completely dominant, over the allele for webbed feet. So we're also going to say we have a total of 500 birds. 320 are going to be homozygous dominant, which means they have webbing or no webbing?
No way.
No webbing, because we decided that one's going to be dominant. 160 are going to be heterozygous, which means they're also going to have no webbing because the dominance is complete. And we're only going to have 20 homozygous recessive individuals. So now we have to calculate the frequency of each of those alleles, which is a lot easier to do than it sounds. So you've got 500 individuals. This gene has two possible alleles. So it's going to have to sum to 1,000. If you look at the homozygous dominant individuals, of which we have 320, they have two copies of that dominant allele, so there are 640 big W's from those guys. If we look at the heterozygous individuals, 160 of those, so we get 160 more big W's from those guys, giving us a total of 800. They also give us 160 little W's, which we can add to the 40 little W's that come from this tiny population of homozygous recessive individuals, for a total of 200 little W's. So our relative allele frequencies are 800 over 1,000, which is 0.8, and 200 over 1,000, which is 0.2. Relative frequencies will always sum to 1. See, that was a lot simpler than it sounded, right? 2 minutes ago, if I asked you to calculate the allele frequency for that population, you probably would have freaked out. But now you can do it like that. Be prepared to do that too. So now we have our raw allele frequencies, which are 800 and 200, and the relative allele frequencies, which are 0.8 and 0.2. Everybody understands how I did that, right? None of that seems confusing? Great. So if we were to take this population and run a Punnett square using those relative allele frequencies, we can then calculate the allele frequencies that we expect in the next generation, which probably also sounds intimidating, but it's going to seem really easy in about 30 seconds after I explain it. So in order to do a Punnett square using relative allele frequencies, you just put them in the places of the alleles, the frequencies I mean, and then when you come to one, or when two meet in a square, you just multiply. So 0.8 times 0.2 gives us 0.16 heterozygous individuals. 0.8 times 0.2, again 0.16. 0.8 times 0.8, that means 0.64 or 64% of the population will be homozygous dominant. And then 0.2 times 0.2 gives you 0.04, or only 4% of the population being homozygous recessive. You add those together, these are our genotype frequencies, relative genotype frequencies. And if you do the math again, we get the exact same allele frequencies. So this is what you would see if the population is not evolving from that generation to the next, right? Because remember, evolution is just a change in allele frequencies over time. The previous generation had the exact same allele frequencies as this generation. No change in allele frequencies means no evolution. Does that make sense? Great. Now we have a term for this. If a population's allele frequencies are not changing, and that population is not evolving, that population is said to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. It's named after a mathematician and a doctor who independently came up with this together at about the same time. Any population that's in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is not evolved. So if a population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, the allele frequencies and the genotype frequencies will remain constant from one generation to the next. Therefore, the Hardy-Weinberg principle tells us that something other than the reshuffling process of sexual reproduction is required to change allele frequencies in the population. That seems obvious now, but 5 minutes ago it probably wouldn't have been obvious. So sexual reproduction alone is not sufficient to cause change in allele frequencies, and it's not sufficient to cause evolution. So in order for a population to maintain Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, it must satisfy 5 conditions. One of which being a very large population, because if you have a small enough population, things can just change by random chance. Another being no gene flow between populations. Gene flow is when organisms will leave a population and go to another one and bring their genes with it. So in order for a population to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, there must be no individuals coming in from outside populations. There must also be no mutations, because mutations can change allele frequencies. They change the alleles themselves. You also have to have random mating. In a case with non-random mating, I'll use that blue-footed booby example again. Say that the blue-footed boobies suddenly decide that individuals with webbed feet are really unattractive. None of them can find a mate. That means that the recessive allele for foot webbing is going to become less and less common as they reproduce less and less. So if you have non-random mating, that can also change allele frequencies from one generation to the next. And finally, no natural selection. In the case of those blue-footed boobies, it would be likely that natural selection would select for webbed feet because these birds tend to swim. They're marine predators. It's actually really cool if you ever seen it. You guys seen a video of blue-footed boobies hunting? You're about to. It's awesome. I should have put this in here to begin with. This is not as good of a video as I was hoping it was going to be. No, I don't want YouTube to go away. So there's a better video, which hopefully is this one. So they usually synchronize the guys when it's it's not also not happening in this video. A lot of people upload these videos and stuff. Here's the one I wanted. This big flock of birds, spot a school of fish. Wait for it. Man. They do that so none of the fish get an early warning. So they did it one at a time, and then like one bird gets a fish and all the fish swim away. So it's kind of cool how they evolved that. See, that was worth it, right? Of course it was. Alright. So we talked about natural selection, non-random mating, all that stuff. You have a question?
Yeah, is there any cases of the argument burning equilibrium? Like, no. I feel like it's really hard to define on natural selection because I feel like there's always going to be.
Right. So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is more of a concept than something we actually observe. It's useful to think about to sort of help illustrate the causes of natural selection and evolution. Good question. Now, speaking of non-random mating, that's also how a lot of funny-looking traits evolve. Because a very strong driver in evolution in animals is female choice. So females tend to be much more selective about mates than males, and this is generally due to the differential reproductive investment. It takes a lot more resources to make an egg than it does to make a sperm. Or if you're an organism that gives live birth, like mammals, it takes a lot more time and resources and effort to carry a baby for 6 or 9 or 11 months, depending on what species you are. Whereas the males can reproduce multiple times in one day if they can find partners. So that's why females tend to be much more selective, and female selection tends to drive the evolution of some really crazy traits, like that guy. That's the prairie chicken. So those weird feathers that look like ears on the back of his head, and those big orange bulbs on the sides of his neck, those exist only to attract females. There's no practical purpose for it. It's just like a Mercedes. I put him in there to illustrate that concept and because he also looks really cool. And I'm going to interject another video because we've got time for it.
Is that like a peacock with their feathers as well?
Yes, that's exactly the same thing. That's the reason peacocks have these enormously ungainly tails that make them much more susceptible to predation, because that's what the ladies like. So eventually female choice it can only go so far because it runs up to a point where the trait becomes so impractical that they start getting killed by predators so much more often. So that's why peacocks don't have even bigger tails than they do. I love this video. So this is another great example of female choice driving the evolution of something really impractical and goofy, but totally awesome. Wait for it. Elsa, let's get it out of here. No practical purpose for this. Just trying to attract ladies.
This forest is so rich that nourishing food can be gathered very quickly. That leaves the male of 6 brood bird have a nice good time to concentrate on other matters, like tidying up his display area.
Cleans up the dance floor for itself.
Everything must be spick and span. Very impressive, but no one is watching. The superb bird of paradise calls to attract the female. And he has more luck. But what does he have to do to really impress her?
Wait till it turns around.
She retires to consider her verdict. It's hard not to feel deflated when even your best isn't good enough.
Yeah. So that's what happens when populations have non-random mating. Yes.
It seemed like that bird was like taking a piece of wood to use it to clear something, or like, wait, could that be considered like a use of a tool? like
Probably, yeah.
Intelligence,
Yeah.
or using a tool?
We observe tooling usage in several other species of animal, including some birds and some fish.
Crow or what?
What?
Crows?
Yeah, crows are actually the smartest bird in the world. They can learn to talk too. There was a really cool experiment I read about where someone trained crows to put a little paper coin into a slot and a little piece of food would come out. And then they started giving them just pieces of paper, and the crows were smart enough to make the coin the right size to put it into the slot to get the food. Really cool stuff. So not only is that tools, that's modification of tools. Alright, lots of cool stuff happens in nature. That video, by the way, was from, I think that was from Animal Planet or Life or something on BBC. If you guys don't watch those documentaries, you really should. Even if you're not interested in science, the cinematography is amazing.
I think it's a Planet Earth.
Planet Earth, that's
Yeah.
it, Planet Earth. And Blue Planet's also a big favorite of mine. They just released Blue Planet 2 recently. I think it's still on Netflix. If you got Netflix, go home and watch it. You will not be disappointed. Anyway, so back to natural selection. There are 3 different types of natural selection. So we know that Natural selection can either act for or act against specific traits based on whether or not they help the animal to reproduce more successfully. And you can group the subsequent effects into three broad categories. So you have stabilizing selection, directional selection, and disruptive selection. So stabilizing selection favors the intermediate phenotype. So if you look at this population, preliminary mode, and sort of keep walking back and forth. If you look at that population down on the bottom left, did it work? Yes. So here's our original population. We have this large bell curve, which is normally what you're going to see when you're making a histogram of any specific trait. In this case, we're talking about fur-colored mice. That's the specific phenotype we're looking at. They have broad range from very light all the way to very dark. In the case of stabilizing selection, that favors the intermediate phenotype, and it's going to select against the extremes on either end. So in this case, it favors the sort of grayish mice, goes against the white ones and the black ones. So subsequent generations, you're going to see more and more of the intermediate phenotype and less of anything else. Basically, it just reduces variation in that phenotype in the population. In the case of directional selection, that will change the population by acting against one extreme, but not both. So in this example here, we see that this hypothetical directional selection is selecting against the white mice, but it favors the intermediate phenotype and the really dark one. So basically what this does is it's going to shift the whole population towards one extreme. The average is going to move towards one extreme. And then one extreme is going to basically disappear after enough generations. In the case of disruptive selection, what this does is it favors both extremes over the intermediate. So using our hypothetical mice example, in the case of disruptive selection here, it's going to select for the white ones and the really dark ones, and it's going to select against the intermediate phenotype. Oops. Which is then going to leave you with a population that has both extremes and not much in between. Which one of these do you suppose is most likely to lead to the creation of a new species? Yeah, probably the disruptive one. If the disruptive selection is intense enough and occurs for long enough, it's quite possible that these two can be completely reproductively isolated after a long enough time. Any questions on this? Yes?
Yeah, just kind of a thought experiment. What would a mass extinction event fall under as far as?
So, depending on what causes it, we call that the bottleneck effect. And the bottleneck effect is any event that kills most of a population, regardless of what traits they do or don't possess. So, a hurricane or a volcanic eruption or a meteor hitting the area is going to wipe out almost everything there, and it's going to leave behind a very small sample of the population. And it's likely that that sample won't be a perfect representation of the allele frequencies in the pre-existing population. So that would be the bottleneck effect. That one generally would not fall under any of these categories, because if it were dependent on any of these any phenotypic trait, we wouldn't consider it the bottleneck effect, because it has to be indiscriminate for that. Any other questions? Yes? Oh. All right. So we have these three broad categories of natural selection. We also end up with, well, there's a couple different ways to categorize evolution. One of them, come on. So if you want to break it up into different categories, in this case, there's two main categories you can break it up into, and they're relatively general. So you have convergent and divergent evolution. In the case of divergent evolution, what you have is, and this is generally what people think of when they hear the word evolution, this is what's more likely to lead to increased speciation. And what it is members of the same species evolving to fit different niches. So this is basically what happened with the Galapagos finches, for instance. You initially had one population that was all the same species, but over enough generations, specific individuals sort of splinter off and start doing something a little bit different, which causes that one species to radiate out into multiple different ones.
And that would be divergent natural selection.
You would probably call that disruptive selection. Now, in the case of convergent evolution, it's basically the opposite. So this is when you have species with different ancestry that will develop similar traits to occupy a similar niche. So in this example here, we have an ichthyosaur, which is an old marine dinosaur. We have a shark, we have a dolphin, and we have a penguin. These are very distantly related organisms that don't share a recent common ancestor. But because they live in the ocean, they've all evolved very similar traits in the form of these fins or flippers that help them swim. Now, divergent and convergent evolution tend to lead to two different broad categories of traits. Divergent evolution, that's the one where one species becomes multiple species. Because all of those species share a common ancestor, they will share something that we call homologous structures. And what a homologous structure is something that has evolved to serve a distinctly different purpose, but because it evolved from the same structure, the same initial structure, it's going to have the same basic instruction in all of the new species that arise. A great example of this is the forelimbs in most vertebrates. So if you look at a human's arm, or a dog's leg, or a bird's wing, or a whale's flipper, they all have the same bones. They all have a humerus, they all have a radius and ulna, they all have metacarpals, carpals, and phalanges. The relative sizes of those bones have just been modified to serve different purposes, but all the same bones are still there. This is what we call homologous structures. Things that serve different purposes, have very different shapes, but still share the same basic instruction because they all evolved from the same trait from that common ancestor of these species. You guys know that some whales have hip bones? Some snakes have hip bones too, even though they don't have legs anymore, because their ancestors used to have legs. Anybody know what that's called? When you have something that's sort of an evolutionary holdover that's not really used for anything anymore. Who read the chapter? Everybody, perfect. It's a vestigial structure. So a vestigial structure is something that is no longer in use, but hasn't completely sort of evolved itself out of existence. So in humans, potential examples would be like wisdom teeth or the appendix. Although we're now starting to find evidence that suggests that the appendix may actually serve a function in the immune system. We used to think it did nothing, but maybe it does. So that's homologous structures, which result from divergent evolution. The converse of that being convergent evolution. This is multiple species that don't share a recent common ancestor, but evolved to live in a similar environment. They end up with something that we call analogous structures. So homologous and analogous. Homo meaning same, analog meaning, I don't know, a representation in a different form. I can't translate that one directly. What? Yeah, similar but different, I guess. That's a good way to say it. Anyway, so these are structures that have evolved to serve a similar purpose, but they have very different construction. A great example of this is the wings in all of our very diverse flying animals. So we have the wing of a bat here, we have the wing of a bird, or the wing of a pterodactyl, or the wing of a moth. Those are all structures that allow the organism to fly, but they all have very different constructions because they've evolved from different structures. Does that make sense? Is everyone pretty comfortable with the difference between homologous and analogous structures? Okay, great. Is anyone surprised to know that your cat has the same bones in its front leg that you have in your arm? I was when I learned that. I had no idea. Okay. So then a couple slides before we wrap this up. Speciation. What is speciation? Yeah, speciation is the creation of new species. This is when new species arise. I probably don't need to be standing up here blocking someone's view anymore. So this is a sketch out of On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, showing the speciation of a bunch of different elephant and elephant-related species. So then how do you define what makes a new species? This is the tough one. Seriously, try. How would you define species? What's that?
That they can reproduce.
Yeah, that's one of the more common definitions, although there are exceptions to it, so it's not perfect. But generally, we consider things that can't make and produce viable fertile offspring to be different species. There are some cases in which different species can produce an offspring, like if you have a male donkey and a female horse, they can mate to produce a mule, but mules are sterile and cannot reproduce themselves, so they're considered non-viable offspring, which still means that donkeys and horses are different species. There are a few other cases where different species, or things that are considered different species, can actually reproduce and produce viable offspring, but it's generally thought in those cases that this is probably just an instance where the speciation process isn't complete yet. It's important to remember that we're not living in end times. Everything is changing now just like it was 100 million years ago. So that's a common definition of species, although it's not perfect. Now there are a bunch of different mechanisms that can cause speciation, or they can give rise to new species. And we will broadly group those into two categories. You have allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. If you haven't heard those words before, which you probably haven't, because you usually never see them outside of a bio textbook, allopatric means living in different areas, and sympatric means living in the same area. So allopatric speciation is going to be speciation as a result of a population being geographically separated from other parts of that population. That may be the formation of a new lake that separates a population of mice. Or you could go all the way back to when Earth just had one continent, and those continents eventually separated. Anything that is going to geographically separate two parts of the same population and make it so they can no longer reproduce with each other is going to generally eventually lead to the formation of new species. There's several reasons for that. One of which being that once you separate a population, any mutations that occur in one of the newly splintered sects of that population, I don't know if sect is the right word, but you know what I mean, those mutations are not going to be shared with the other population. And they're going to accumulate different mutations from each other, which will eventually give rise to new traits. It's also quite likely that if a population gets separated into two new populations, their areas are going to be somewhat different. They're going to face different environmental pressures and different selective forces, which is another way that they can end up becoming new species, being distinct from each other. If this carries on long enough, it's likely that even if they were geographically reunited, it would still be reproductively isolated. Now, sympatric speciation is usually less extreme and occurs more slowly because that happens when they're living together. Usually it ends up being the result of niche partitioning or resource partitioning, like we saw with the Galapagos finches. That's an example of sympatric speciation. Everybody get the differences there? Everybody understands why allopatric speciation is more likely to create new species? Great. Okay, so then, last slide, we're going to finish up with a few common misconceptions about evolution, because this is one of the most controversial subjects in all of biology. People are always trying to disprove it. One of the ones I hear all the time from people who don't understand what we're talking about is evolution is just a theory. And yeah, it's a theory in the same sense that gravity is a theory. So people who use this anti-evolution argument are sort of conflating the common definition of the word theory with the scientific use together. So in casual situations, a theory is basically just a guess. In science, a theory is something that's been developed through rigorous experimentation and a whole lot of people trying really hard to disprove it. That's what constitutes a theory in science. So while it's not 100% fact. We never really try to claim anything's 100% fact in science because it's all subject to change if new information were to arise. A theory is not something that's just a casual, capricious guess. Another common misconception among individuals that aren't even denying evolution, they just don't really understand it, is that individuals can evolve. I mentioned earlier that they can't. Evolution only happens at the population level, never at the individual level. Everybody remember that. Like I said, someone's going to get that wrong in the test, don't let it be you. Another common misconception is that evolution is supposed to somehow explain the origin of life. So a lot of people will argue against evolution by saying, oh, well, it doesn't explain how life came about, so obviously it's a bunch of BS. Nobody pretends that evolution explains the origin of life. I don't think anyone really pretends that we even know for sure what the origin of life is. The prevailing scientific theory is just the spontaneous origin of life, but that's something entirely separate from evolution. This just explains how species change over time. Another problem is people thinking that evolution is goal-directed, or that it happens on purpose, or that organisms, want to evolve. This is also, obviously incorrect. If I could make myself evolve, I would absolutely give myself gills so that I could never drown. That would be amazing. But can't do that. It's not how it works. You evolve based on natural selective forces on your population that act on genes that have arisen randomly through very rare mutations. This is the one that really gets me. And you see this one a lot with climate change too. People trying to, create this controversy that isn't there. This is not a controversial subject among scientists. This hasn't been a controversial subject among scientists for over 100 years. It was still a little bit controversial when Darwin first proposed it, but within about 20 years, the entire biological community was on board with this. Or at least enough that we can consider it a consensus, like 97, 98%. There's a few holdout weirdos for some reason. And this is one of those things, particularly with climate change, I think I might have mentioned this talking about climate change earlier in the semester, where I've had friends tell me that they're annoyed that you can't even question it without being labeled a crazy kook anymore. And that's good, that's right. But when we have this much evidence, you're not allowed to question it unless you have counter evidence. You can't just be like, well, how do we really know that 2 + 2 = 4? Unless you have evidence that it doesn't, sit down and shut up. And finally, the idea that other theories should be taught in schools. There are no other scientific theories regarding the subject. Very bizarre. And fortunately, we live in a great place like California where they're not cramming, some other weird BS down our throats in school, because this is the only thing that is the least bit scientific. The last competing scientific theory was proposed by a French guy named Lamarck, and he was the guy who thought that acquired traits could be passed on to your offspring. We found out a long time ago that was wrong. That was the last time any real scientist had any other theory regarding this. And that was over 100 years ago. Okay, so does anyone have any questions? All right, so in that case, we are done. I thought we were going to get done early. We're done just about time. As always, office hours start right here and right now. And I promise I'll have your exams back to you on Thursday.
So she's like, you could put in a condition to maintain it, but like, that thing's work. Okay. Yeah, I would get. Give me a look. So for the chapter, what do we want to focus on?
So the big things for this one would be, probably the most important thing would be make sure you understand the three things that have to be true in order for natural selection to act on a trait. That's one of the biggest things.
Oh, wait.
I mean, what I'll probably try to do is write this down and post it on campus tonight.
That would help.
Yeah, so I figure it might be better if I write individual study guides for each chapter as we finish them. But, so the big things to know for this one would be those three things that have to happen for natural selection to act on a trait. Definitely know the three different major types of natural selection, like the stabilizing, directional, disruptional, or disruptive. Definitely know the differences between convergent and divergent evolution.
Between,
Convergent and divergent evolution.
so on the virgin evolution, like what exactly do we need to know?
So refer back to the slides for that one and also to the book chapter. Do you remember what divergent evolution is?
The following with the new species, the homologous.
Yeah, so if you know what the word diverge means, then it becomes obvious. Because what does it mean for something to diverge? Diverge means to split off in two different directions. So if you know what diverge means, then it becomes obvious what divergent evolution is. They did that on purpose. They gave it a very descriptive name. Same thing with convergent. What does it mean for things to converge? So for two or more things to converge, what that means is they come together. So if you know what converge means, then convergent evolution becomes obvious as well. And it's also important to understand the implications of those, like the homologous and analogous structures.
You're gonna email this to us?
I'm gonna put it on Canvas.
And like scribbling.
Yeah, I'm probably talking kind of fast, but I'll write most of this stuff down in the same format that I've been doing with the study guides before. And I'll probably start putting up individual chapter study guides instead of grouping it all for one test.
Okay, I didn't get the part for the allometric speciation, the one that where you said multi-integrated species. What exactly,
So allopatric speciation means when it happens in different locations. So to say that two organisms or two species are allopatric means they live in different areas. They don't live together. To say that they're sympatric means they live in the same place at the same time. So allopatric speciation is when a population gets divided up into multiple areas and is physically separated from itself or from the other parts of itself. That's when new species arise in different locations. That can be due to several factors, like the accumulation of mutations in one of the new subpopulations that won't be shared with the other subpopulation. Or it could be due to the fact that the two environments they now live in are different enough that different traits become beneficial. So selection may act on different traits in that case. Like, the example in the textbook is the spotted owl. So we have the northern spotted owl, which lives in the coastal forests of Northern California, Oregon, and Washington. And we have the Mexican spotted owl, which lives in Mexico. They're not exactly sure how or when the two populations got separated, they just know that they did. And because the northern spotted owl lives in a much colder, wetter environment, and the Mexican spotted owl lives in a much warmer, drier place, they're subjected to different selective pressures. So they've, over time, evolved or accumulated different traits that are beneficial for their specific environment. So that's what makes them different species. What else would be important to know? I guess understand, well, definitely know who Charles Darwin was. That'll probably be on the test. People should know that anyway, though. Yeah, I expect people to walk into this class already having heard of Charles Darwin before you bring up his name. It's like Einstein, it's one of those
Yeah, I
people you
remember
know about.
that.
So the two observations Darwin made, which led into his two inferences, which basically describe evolution. Those observations being that, no, that was something else. What I'm talking about here was when I said that he observed that populations have variation in traits. And the second observation was that that was that all populations of all species are capable of reproducing more offspring than their environment can support. So if you just look at those two observations, and you know that not everybody that's born is going to survive long enough to reproduce, and you know that different members have different traits, it then makes sense that some individuals are going to survive better because of their traits, and that they're going to pass those traits on. And then that in future generations, those traits are going to become more and more common. And that's really all evolution is. It takes massive amounts of time, usually, for new species to arise. I was at the Natural History Museum in London a couple months ago, and they have this really cool exhibit where they have actual, like, real specimens of skulls from basically everything that's related to humans, and they set them up in this evolutionary tree, and you can see like the lineages branch off, and you can see how the skull shape changes slightly with each one. It's really cool stuff. If you guys ever get a chance to go to London, do it, and absolutely go to the museums. Their museums are amazing, and they're all free.
Oh, they're free.
Yeah, they're all free for everybody all the time. It's so cool.
How long were you in London for?
I was in the UK for about 2 weeks visiting a friend, and during the week when he had to work, I did a side trip to Scotland and Ireland, and then came back on the weekends when he was free again. Yeah. London has the best museums in the world, hands down. The British Museum, which my buddy calls the Museum of Conquest, because it's basically artifacts that Britain has stolen from all over the world for 500 years and refuses to give back. That's really impressive to see too. They have like half of the Parthenon in that museum. And Greece wants it back, and Britain won't give it back. They have Cleopatra. I saw Cleopatra. Not like Cleopatra's stuff or Cleopatra's tomb. The actual Cleopatra is in a glass case in that museum.
The allele frequency, I don't think we get that one.
Okay, so allele frequencies, that basically just means the number of each allele in the population. So it's going to be easier to explain this if I put that slide back up. And yeah, this is another thing you should definitely know.
Like know how to calculate it, like if you give us a number?
Yeah, you should definitely know how to calculate it, and it's actually really easy.
Do we need to know the Punnett square as well with that?
Yes. It would be a very good idea to know how to do this with the Punnett square. So allele frequencies are really simple. So at any given gene, any given locus, each individual can have 2 alleles. We'll have 2 alleles. So if you want to calculate the frequency of each allele, you just break them up by genotype. So in this case, the homozygous dominant individuals, they have 2 copies of the dominant allele. So if we have 320 homozygous dominant individuals, that means 320 times 2, or 640 copies of the dominant allele. If you have 160 heterozygous individuals, they're going to have one copy of that dominant allele. So that adds 160 more to that total. In this case, 640 plus 160 gives you 800. So in this population of 500 birds, which have a total of 1,000 alleles, 800 of those alleles are the dominant one. You do the same kind of math for the recessive allele, and you get a total of 200. So the raw allele frequencies in this case are 800 dominant, 200 recessive. The relative frequencies, and to calculate relative, it's just relative proportion. So you divide the number of dominant alleles over the total number of alleles, 800 over 1,000, gives you 0.8. Do the same math with the recessive allele, 0.2. Those are the relative allele frequencies.
Okay, so divide the amount by the total?
Yeah. So whenever you're calculating relative frequency of anything, it doesn't have to be alleles. It could be, the number of green Skittles in a bag of Skittles. If you want the relative frequency of green Skittles, you count all the green ones, and then you divide that by the total number of Skittles in the bag.
So basically, the genotypes, when they're both the same, you double it, and then in the middle, when there's a W and a small W, you split it to the other two.
Yeah. So that's one way to think about it. Basically, you can just count the number of alleles, like number of dominant alleles in this individual. It's 2.
Yeah.
And then you multiply that by the number of homozygous dominant individuals, and that gives you 640.
Yeah. Double, yeah.
In this case, you count the dominant ones,
Yeah. So
except in heterozygotes. So in this case, you count the dominant alleles. There's only 1 per individual. 1 times 160 gives you 160 more. Here, we got 2 recessive guys. 2 times 20 gives us 40. Here we have 160 more. 1 times 160, add that to 200. Relative frequencies will always sum to 1.
Are we always gonna have 3 different types of, like, an example like that? Are you gonna give us 3 different examples?
I could potentially give you, it'd probably be more complicated than I'd want to give you guys if I had more than 2 alleles in the population. But it's conceptually the exact same thing. Like, I should be able to give you guys something like human blood group, which has 3 different alleles. And you should still be able to calculate the allele frequencies just as easily.
What if it had 4? Would that hurt?
It would, I mean, that could happen. I wouldn't put that in the test. But even if I did, you should still be able to do it fairly easily. I'll give you an example with human blood group. So, let's say that we have, I'm going to make the numbers really easy to work with. We've got 10 people. And in this population, we have 1 person with blood type AB. With the genotype down here. And we're going to say we have 2 people that are homozygous for A, 1 person that's homozygous for B. We're going to have, let's see, that's 4. So then we're going to have 1 person that is heterozygous for A. That gives us a total of 5. And then to make this slightly more relevant.
Is that AI? AI?
Yeah. Because remember, the allele for O is just that lowercase I. And because type O is the most common blood type there is, I'm going to say we have 5 people that are type O, or heterozygous homozygous, sorry. So now how do we calculate these allele frequencies? Let's see. So I'm just going to put tallies here, because this is really as easy as it is. So our 3 possible alleles are A, B, and I. Now because we only have 10 people, this is going to be really easy to count. This person gives us 1 copy of the allele. These 2 people each give us 2. So we have 1, and then how many come from these guys?
2.
Those 2 people.
Also, 4.
4, right. So that gives us 4 more, so now we're at 5. And we have 1 more from this person. So we have 6 copies of allele A. Now if we look at B, we get 1 from this person, and we get 2 from this 1 person for a total of 3. Now looking at I, 1 from this person.
How come you only got I'm confused. So you get one B, right, from one, and then from, oh, it's because one person.
Yeah, so this is the number of individuals that have this genotype. So then we get one allele for I from that person, and then a total of 10 from these 5 people because they each have 2. So that gives us a total of 11. So 6, 3, 11. Now, how many total alleles do we have in this population? Yeah, how'd you get that number?
I don't know the numbers.
Yeah, so we have 10 people that each have 2, 10 times 2 is 20.
Mm-hmm.
So if we take 6 divided by 20, what's that going to be? About 3.6. Anybody? Who's got a calculator? It should be like 0.3 something.
0.3.
0.3 exactly.
I'm doing it.
Is that what it is?
6 divided by 20,
Yeah.
divided by 0.3.
0.3 exactly, okay. So now we have 0.3. How about 3 divided by 20? 0.15. I guess I should have been able to guess that. And then finally, 11 divided by 20 should be just more than 0.5. In fact, I don't even need you to tell me, watch this. I can add these two together. 0.3 plus 0.15 equals 0.45. And because I know they have to sum to 1, I can do 1 minus 0.45. And I can tell you that that's exactly 0.55. So that's really all it is, calculating allele frequencies.
They're more than.
Theoretically, I should be able to give you a population of 2,000 people and a gene that has 9 different alleles. And it should take you a lot more time, but it shouldn't be any harder to calculate that. Because it'll work the exact same way. Now the Punnett square can't be done as easily in this case because we have 3 different alleles. So instead, I'm going to give you a hypothetical example. Let's say that let's say we only had 2 alleles, and we ended up with relative frequencies of 0.6 and 0.4. And I'm going to use the letter M because it's a hypothetical allele. The dominant one is going to be 0.6. The recessive one is going to be 0.4. So now if we want to predict allele frequencies in the next generation, assuming Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, we make our Punnett square. In this case, we have dominant allele 0.6, the recessive allele at 0.4, again dominant 0.6, recessive 0.4. Now, I'll probably need someone with a calculator again. So for this square, we have 0.6 times 0.6. What does that give us? 0.36? That sounds right. So we have 36% of the population is going to be homozygous dominant. Over here, 6 times 0.4, or 0.6 times 0.4, we've got that one. 0.24. So we will have 2 squares of that for our heterozygous individuals. 0.24 and 0.24 giving us a total of 48% of the population is heterozygotes. And then 0.4 times 0.4, 0.16, thank you. 16% of the population is going to be homozygous recessive. Now, if we want to calculate our allele frequencies, that's easily enough done. Remember, 36% of the population is homozygous dominant. 48% of the population is heterozygous. And 16% of the population is homozygous recessive. So in this case, we basically just have to split this one and add it to either one. So in this case, we have 0.36 plus 0.24 equals 0.6 is our relative frequency for dominant allele. And in this case, 0.24 plus 0.16 equals 0.4 as the relative allele frequency for our recessive allele, which, big surprise, not at all surprised, is the exact same allele frequency we start with, because we're assuming Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. No change in allele frequencies.
So on quiz, we're gonna do that one?
Yeah, do we have a quiz on Thursday?
No, it's Tuesday.
Tuesday, okay. I was gonna say, I didn't think I made it that fast. So the quiz will cover this chapter and as far as we get on Thursday.
Sorry, I forgot, did you say we need to know that, right?
Yeah, and you should at least know the basics of that. It may be more likely that the full calculation of Punnett square might show up as an extra credit question instead.
Okay,
So you want to know how to do that.
I still need.
Yeah, remember that each quiz just covers the stuff we've covered since the most recent quiz exam.
So that each lecture you're gonna put up on the,
Yeah, I'm gonna try to put up a brief summary of a study guide for this chapter tonight. And this video should hopefully also be up tonight. And I should probably stop recording because this video is going to be really long as it is.